Throughout Doctor Who's long history, many stories have earned the title of a Doctor Who first, leaving a lasting mark on the show's legacy. The Daleks didn't just introduce the Doctor's most iconic enemies, it was also the show's first alien world, the first non-humanoid species, and the moment Doctor Who truly exploded into the public consciousness. The 10th planet gave us both the debut of the Cybermen and the groundbreaking concept of regeneration. And if you shift the focus to the show's evolution behind the scenes, Spearhead From Space stands out as the first story filmed and broadcast entirely in colour. But what if I told you there's another story, quieter, less flashy, often overlooked, that is just as important as these giants? A story that didn't just introduce something new, it changed the entire rulebook for what Doctor Who could be. That story is the Time Meddler, a rule breaker, a format changer, a blueprint for decades of storytelling to come. It may not have the instant gravitas of regeneration or the Daleks, but it redefined how Doctor Who could tell stories, and opened the door to countless future possibilities. So let's take a look at this rebellious little gem and uncover what truly makes the Time Meddler a game changer in Doctor Who history. Doctor Who first arrived on British television on the 23rd of November 1963 with An Unearthly Child. From the outset, BBC head of drama Sidney Newman, one of the programme's co-creators, had a very clear vision. The series was to avoid the bug-eyed monsters, focus on education, and use the Doctor and his companions as guides through real moments of Earth's history. Time travel was the hook, but learning was the intention. That idea didn't last long. Just 4 weeks later, the show's second story, The Daleks, introduced exactly the kind of alien menaces Newman wanted to avoid, but their immediate popularity was impossible to ignore. The Daleks didn't just grab public attention, they transformed Doctor Who. Suddenly, the BBC realised the show's potential didn't lie only in historical storytelling, but in full-blooded science fiction. Even so, during its first year, Doctor Who alternated between these two formats. Pure historical adventures like Marco Polo, The Aztecs, and The Reign of Terror sat beside alien-filled sci-fi stories. The programme was already demonstrating its elasticity, its ability to shift tone, style, and genre from week to week, and that versatility would be crucial for the long-term survival of the show. By season 2, change was becoming part of Doctor Who's DNA. On the screen, the cast began to evolve. First Susan's departure, then Ian and Barbara's emotional farewell, replaced by the youthful Vicky and the action-orientated Stephen. Off-screen, the writing team increasingly leaned into science fiction concepts, even while still delivering strong historical episodes like The Romans and The Crusades. But then came the season 2 finale, a story that didn't simply alternate between genres, but combined them. A story that didn't test the rules, but completely rewrote them. That story was The Time Meddler, and it would change the possibilities of Doctor Who forever. The Time Meddler was written by Dennis Spooner, who by 1965 was already one of Doctor Who's most influential creative voices. He penned historical adventures like The Reign of Terror and The Romans, completed a 6-month stint as a script editor, and was partly responsible for injecting more humour into the series. Although Spooner had a strong grasp of pure historical storytelling, he was equally eager to push Doctor Who further into futuristic science fiction territory, without abandoning history altogether. His successor as script editor Donald Tosh shared that ambition, but with no time to bring in an outside writer, Spooner took on the task himself. That decision planted the seed that would grow into the Time Meddler. Now, I have to admit, calling the Time Meddler Doctor Who's first pseudo-historical story isn't entirely accurate. The very concept of the Doctor and his companions is already science fiction, and earlier stories have brushed against genre blending. Even the very first story, An Unearthly Child, begins with a contemporary sci-fi mystery before shifting into prehistorical drama. And the story immediately before the Time Meddler, The Chase, flirts with mixing genres when the Daleks inadvertently cause the desertion of the Mary Celeste. But in those stories, the blend only lasts moments, or just for an episode. Doctor Who had still never devoted an entire narrative to fully merging historical drama with science fiction ideas. That changes here. The Time Meddler opens by introducing Stephen Taylor as a full-time companion, having smuggled aboard the TARDIS at the end of the chase. Stephen's skepticism about time travel becomes crucial, because much of the opening episode the viewer is encouraged to share his doubts, right up until the evidence begins to stack up. The TARDIS lands on the quiet Northumbrian beach, where the arrival is witnessed by a monk who reacts not with shock, but with curiosity. Shortly after, the Doctor discovers that they are in the year 1066, just before the Battle of Stamford Bridge and the infamous Battle of Hastings. But it quickly becomes clear that something is wrong. The monk, seemingly living amongst the local Saxons, possesses items no one in 11th century England should have: a wristwatch, a gramophone, a modern-style cannon. Bit by bit, the story builds a sense of escalating anachronism. Crucially, while earlier historical stories place the TARDIS crew at the centre of pivotal events, the Time Meddler keeps them slightly removed. King Harold, Harold Hardrada, and the major figures of 1066 never appear. Instead, the story takes place on the fringes, in a quiet coastal village where strange things are happening. The shift gives the narrative room to play, not as grand retelling of history, but as a mystery that peels back layers of something completely out of place. From the eerie chanting in the monastery, actually a record player the monk has left running, to scenes of him serving breakfast with electrical appliances, healing a villager with penicillin, or plotting with modern tools, Spooner uses every opportunity to build suspicion. Meanwhile, a Viking scouting party arrives and attacks a Saxon settlement, reminding us that real history is still unfolding in the background. And yet, the tone remains surprisingly light. Unlike the darker, more perilous historicals that came before, the Time Meddler is cheekier, more playful, and almost mischievous in how it points out each historical inconsistency. It's as if Spooner is deliberately challenging the boundaries Doctor Who had lived within for 2 seasons, saying, "Look what we can get away with now." All of this, though, builds to one of the most significant cliffhangers in classic Who. Episode 3's reveal that the monk has his own TARDIS. The Doctor is no longer the only time traveller, and the rules have well and truly been broken. Although the audience may suspect the monk's true nature early on, it's Vicky and Stephen's discovery of his TARDIS that finally confirms it. The monk is a time traveller, like the Doctor, piloting a machine identical in principle to the TARDIS. The term Time Lord wouldn't be coined until years later, but the implication is unmistakable. Even before the reveal, the playful hostility between the Doctor and the monk suggests a shared history, or at least that this isn't their first encounter with one another. Back in 1965, almost nothing was known about the Doctor's origins compared to the mythology we're familiar with today. This mystery was central to the character's appeal. The very title of the show, Doctor Who, was built around that enigma. Prior to the Time Meddler, audiences knew only the basics. The Doctor was not human, he travelled in the TARDIS, and he and his granddaughter Susan came from the same unnamed world. Beyond the brief atmospheric description of their home planet in the Sensorites, viewers were kept deliberately in the dark. So when the Time Meddler revealed that the monk came from the Doctor's home world and had his own TARDIS, it must have been quite a moment of genuine astonishment for 1960s audiences. For the first time, the Doctor wasn't unique. Yet the mystery didn't vanish, it deepened. There's no mention of Gallifrey or Time Lords of any of the lore that later stories would develop. Instead, what we're given is a philosophical contrast. 2 time travellers with radically different ideas about what that responsibility means. The Doctor is cautious, observant, a traveller who generally avoids altering the course of history unless some external threat forces his hand. The monk, by contrast, is gleefully irresponsible. He boasts about helping build Stonehenge, feeding Leonardo da Vinci with ideas for flying machines, and generally nudging history along because he finds it more entertaining. He sees himself as improving things, accelerating humanity towards greatness. From his perspective, he's doing good. This makes him a fascinating kind of antagonist. Not malicious, not power-hungry, but just misguided. He blends so seamlessly into the local community that the villagers accept him as one of their own. He even tends to their injuries with modern medicine. And when he captures the Doctor, he treats him almost as a guest rather than a prisoner. His frustration with the Doctor comes not from hatred, but from the irritation of his fun spoiled by someone he thought might appreciate it. Even his one lethal plan, using the cannons against the Vikings, carries a strange moral ambiguity, since those Vikings were historically doomed at Stamford Bridge anyway. The story maintains a playful tone, and much of that comes down to Peter Butterworth's performance. With a background in pantomime and light entertainment, and soon to become a fixture of the Carry On films, Butterworth gives the monk a mischievous charm that lightens the narrative without undermining the threat he poses. Despite the comedy, the monk's presence is hugely significant. His introduction marks the first time the show pulls back the curtain on the Doctor's larger world. He represents the beginning of a slow, deliberate unveiling, one that eventually leads to Gallifrey, the Time Lords, and the vast mythology that defines Doctor Who today. On broadcast, and in the many decades since, the Time Meddler has generally received positive reviews. Critics praised its refreshing approach, the move away from relying on alien creatures, the playful use of anachronisms, and its willingness to experiment with form. And while I personally find it fascinating and influential, I have to admit, the story does drag in places. Episode 2 is particularly affected by William Hartnell's absence, which was common during the era due to the relentless weekly production scheduling. Actors took holidays mid-story, and the scripts had to bend around it. But the Doctor's disappearance slows the narrative noticeably. Stephen and Vicky spend much of the middle episodes shuttling between the beach, the monastery, and the village, repeatedly searching for the Doctor, or growing suspicious of the monk, and discovering out-of-place objects, and even briefly being mistaken for Viking spies. It's only when the Doctor returns in episode 3 that the story snaps back into life, especially during his scenes opposite the monk. That said, slow-build narratives are a hallmark of many First Doctor stories. Judging them by storytelling standards of the later eras is always tricky, as television evolves. What felt fresh and innovative in 1965 can seem meandering to modern eyes, and that's more a reflection of our expectations than the story's original impact. Visually, the production was limited even by early Doctor Who standards. Much of the budget had been consumed by the chase, with its many sets and ambitious scope, leaving the Time Meddler restrained by necessity. Despite this, director Douglas Camfield, soon to become one of the show's most respected directors, makes strong creative choices. The sparse incidental music creates atmosphere when needed, and he cleverly employs stock footage from the 1949 newsreel The Land of the Vikings to portray the Viking ships approaching the coast. Given Spooner's inventive script and the story's positive reception, you might expect the production team to seize the moment and lean fully into the pseudo-historical format. But that isn't what happened. The departure of original producer Verity Lambert and the arrival of John Wiles in season 3 lightly shifted priorities. The pure historical stories continued. The Mythmakers, the Massacre, the Gunfighters, and eventually the Smugglers in season 4. Yet none were embraced with the same enthusiasm as the sci-fi or monster-driven stories of the era. Ratings reflected this. Historical settings became seen, fairly or not, as a liability. Instead, the show continued blending history and science fiction in other ways. The Daleks' master plan dipped briefly into ancient Egypt and even a silent film set, reuniting us with the monk along the way. These flirtations with the pseudo-historical format were still exceptions rather than the new norm. With Patrick Troughton's arrival, Doctor Who moved decisively into the monster era. Fully historical stories vanished for years. The few historical set stories, such as the Highlanders or the partly pseudo-historical The Evil of the Daleks, no longer followed the template the Time Meddler had established. Only the Abominable Snowmen hints at a fully embraced pseudo-historical tone. The Third Doctor's era, dominated by Earthbound adventures, offered limited opportunities. But in 1973 the Time Warrior appeared, a story with parallels to the Time Meddler. A medieval setting, a time-travelling antagonist, a playful tone, yet it approached the idea differently. But I'll explore that later. It wasn't really until the Fourth Doctor era that the pseudo-historical format truly took hold. Stories such as Pyramids of Mars, The Talent of Wen Chiang, and Horror of Fan Rock embraced the blend of historical aesthetics, period settings, and sci-fi menace. From that point onward, the format became a familiar and beloved part of the show's identity. Every classic Doctor, from Tom Baker onwards, had at least one pseudo-historical story under their belt. In the revived series, the approach has become more central. Modern audiences respond strongly to stories that combine a real historical backdrop with a science fiction twist. Exactly the formula the Time Meddler pioneered. These stories satisfy both the educational roots of the 1963 brief and the sci-fi adventure the show evolved into. So, Did the Time Meddler immediately reshape Doctor Who into something new? Not really. The pseudo-historical format didn't explode overnight. Its influence was slow, subtle and uneven, and arguably it was the success of the later Fourth Doctor stories that convinced producers that the idea was worth revisiting regularly. Where the Time Meddler truly leaves its mark is in what it reveals about the Doctor. It opened the door just a crack onto the mythology of the Time Lords. That crack widened in 1969 with the War Games, which finally introduced the term Time Lord and revealed another rogue figure from the Doctor's world, the War Chief. Like the monk, he believed he was using his abilities for a greater purpose, albeit with far more dangerous consequences. As the show progressed into the Pertwee and Baker eras, we met Time Lords of every persuasion. Corrupt politicians like Gough, fellow adventurers like Romana, amoral scientists like the Rani, megalomaniacs like the Master, and even mythic godlike figures such as Omega and Rassilon. The Time Warrior finally named the Doctor's home planet Gallifrey, cementing what had been mystery into mythology. All of this can be traced back to the moment in the Time Meddler when the Doctor's uniqueness was shattered by the sight of another TARDIS. So, while the Time Meddler may not have triggered an instant revolution in Doctor Who storytelling, it did break the rules, challenge expectations, and plant narrative seeds that the show would cultivate for decades. Its influence is not always direct, but it is undeniable. It reminds us that Doctor Who survives because it evolves, by daring to experiment, daring to defy its own formulas, and daring to be just a little bit rebellious. And without that spirit, the show might have never lasted beyond William Hartnell's tenure. But tell me, what do you think? Is the Time Meddler that game-changing story? Is it an all-time classic? Maybe it could have taken the opportunity better to hold more instant influence on the show. Or maybe its status is overblown. Let me know in the comments below. But for now, it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for.